The first tremor hit at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September, just as the morning shift was settling into their routine 3,000 feet below the surface of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky. David Brennan felt it through the soles of his steel-toed boots, a subtle vibration that most of the crew dismissed as the usual settling of ancient rock. But David, who had spent 18 years as a mining engineer in these tunnels, knew better. He stopped mid-stride in Tunnel 7, his headlamp casting shadows across the limestone walls, and pressed his palm against the cold stone. The second tremor came 30 seconds later, stronger this time, sending a cascade of dust from the ceiling. "Everyone out!" David called to the 4 miners working the far end of the tunnel. "Now!" Before we continue with David's story, if you're enjoying this tale of survival and human ingenuity, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world who appreciate these incredible true stories of rescue and resilience. The third tremor never came. Instead, the mountains simply gave way. David heard it before he felt it, a deep, grinding roar that seemed to originate from the Earth's core itself. The support beams in Tunnel 7 groaned and splintered. Somewhere in the distance, possibly in the main shaft, something massive collapsed. The lights went out, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the battery-powered headlamps each man wore. Then came the water. It started as a trickle, seeping through cracks in the tunnel walls that hadn't existed moments before. Within seconds, the trickle became a stream, and the stream became a torrent. David's mind raced through the geology he'd studied, the maps he'd memorized. They were dangerously close to an abandoned section of the mine that had been sealed off in 1987 after flooding from an underground aquifer. That seal had just broken. "Move toward the equipment bay!" David shouted over the rushing water, already ankle-deep and rising. The 4 miners, Jack Patterson, Robert Chen, Louis Vargas, and Timothy Wolfe, scrambled through the darkness, their headlamps bouncing chaotically off the walls. David brought up the rear, his engineer's brain already calculating. The main shaft was compromised. He could hear the distinct sound of structural collapse echoing through the tunnels. The emergency exits would be blocked. They had maybe 5 minutes before this section flooded completely. The equipment bay was a small chamber carved into the rock where the crew stored tools, spare parts, and emergency supplies. It sat slightly elevated from the main tunnel floor, which might buy them precious time. David's crew reached it just as the water hit their knees. He did a quick head count. All 5 of them had made it, but behind them, Tunnel 7 was disappearing beneath black, churning water. "The radio!" Jack gasped, pointing to the emergency communication system mounted on the wall. David grabbed the handset, but the line was dead. The water had already reached the main relay station. They were cut off, 3,000 feet underground, with no way to call for help. Robert, the youngest of the group at 24, started to panic. "We're going to drown down here. We're not going to drown," David said firmly, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "But we need to think, and we need to move fast." He swept his headlamp across the equipment bay, taking inventory: welding equipment, timber supports, coils of rope, compressed air tanks, tool chests, and in the corner, stacked against the wall, were the materials they'd been using to reinforce Tunnel 8. Sheets of heavy-grade plywood, metal drums that had contained drilling mud, and dozens of empty plastic barrels that once held lubricant. An idea began to form. "The water's coming from the old aquifer breach," David explained, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It'll flood the lower tunnels first, but eventually it'll fill everything. We can't go down, and we can't go back. But there's a ventilation shaft that connects to Tunnel 12, about 40 feet up from where we are now." He pointed to a spot on the ceiling where the rock face showed signs of different stratification. "If we can get to that shaft, we can climb to higher ground." "How?" Luis asked. "The water's already waist-deep and there's no ladder." "We build one," David said, "and we build a platform that floats. We turn this equipment bay into a lifeboat." For the next 3 hours, as the water rose inexorably around them, David directed his crew in a feat of improvised engineering that would either save their lives or prove to be their final, desperate act. They lashed together the empty plastic barrels with rope and welding cable, creating flotation devices. The sheets of plywood became decking, secured to the barrels with every nail, screw, and bolt they could salvage. The metal drums, still partially filled with drilling mud, were emptied and sealed, then added to the structure for additional buoyancy. Jack, who had worked construction before coming to the mines, understood what David was doing. "You're building a raft," he said, not quite believing it. "Not just a raft," David corrected, using a power drill running on battery to secure another plywood sheet. "We're building something that can rise with the water level and keep us stable while we work on reaching that ventilation shaft." He glanced at the waterline, now chest-high. "We've got maybe an hour before this bay is completely submerged. Once we're floating, we'll have access to the upper sections of these walls. We can drill anchor points, attach ropes, and create a way up." Robert, his panic now channeled into focused work, was securing the perimeter of their makeshift platform. What if the whole mine floods before rescue comes? "Then we keep climbing," David said simply. "The mine has 17 levels. We're on level 8. If we can reach level 1, we'll be only a few hundred feet from the surface, close enough that rescue teams might hear us signaling." Timothy, the oldest of the crew at 56, paused in his work to look at David. "You really think we can make it?" David met his eyes. "I think we don't have any other choice but to try." As the water reached their shoulders, they finished the platform and climbed aboard. It was crude, barely 10 feet by 8 feet, made from salvaged materials and desperation. But when the water lifted it from the floor of the equipment bay, it held. All 5 men, their tools and their remaining supplies rose with the flood, floating in the darkness of the tunnel like shipwreck survivors in an underground sea. David had transformed their death trap into a vessel of survival. But this was only the beginning. As the water continued to rise through the miles of tunnel beneath the Kentucky mountains, David Brennan and his crew faced a question that would haunt them for the next 27 days. How long could they keep climbing before the mountain swallowed them whole? The platform bobbed gently in the flooded equipment bay, their headlamps creating dancing reflections on the black water surrounding them. David distributed the remaining battery packs. They had maybe 48 hours of light if they conserved carefully. After that, they'd be working in complete darkness. He pushed that thought aside and focused on the immediate problem: accessing the ventilation shaft. Using a measuring tape and his knowledge of the tunnel's original construction blueprints, David estimated the shaft opening was now only about 15 feet above their current water level. But reaching it would require drilling into solid rock to create anchor points for climbing, and that would drain their batteries even faster. "We work in shifts," David announced. 2 men drilling, 2 men resting, 1 man keeping watch on the water level and our supplies. Every 6 hours we rotate." He checked his watch, a battered Timex that had survived countless shifts underground. "It's 10:15 a.m. Topside, they know something's wrong. The seismographs would have picked up the collapse, and we missed our hourly check-in. Rescue operations have already started." This knowledge gave the men hope, but David kept his deeper concerns to himself. He knew the scale of the structural damage from the sounds he'd heard during the initial collapse. The main shaft was likely destroyed, which meant rescue teams couldn't simply descend to their location. They would need to drill new access tunnels or clear tons of debris, work that could take weeks or even months. The crew couldn't wait that long. Jack and Luis took the first drilling shift. Using a battery-powered hammer drill, they began creating a ladder of anchor points in the limestone wall above them. Each hole took precious minutes to complete, and the drill's battery indicator dropped steadily. But slowly, Methodically, they worked their way upward, inserting steel bolts into each hole and attaching rope loops that would serve as handholds. Meanwhile, Robert organized their supplies. They had 6 gallons of drinking water in sealed containers, a dozen energy bars, and some candy bars from Jack's lunchbox. It wasn't much. David did the math in his head. 5 men, minimal rations, could survive maybe 10 days if they were careful. But they would weaken considerably before then, making the physical demands of climbing increasingly dangerous. Timothy, taking the first watch shift, noticed something that made his blood run cold. "David," he called quietly, "the water's still rising, but it's not just rising, it's rising faster." David moved to the edge of the platform and studied the waterline against the tunnel wall. Timothy was right. What had been a gradual increase was now accelerating. "The pressure's building behind the breach," David explained. "The aquifer is massive, possibly connected to the whole underground water system in this region. We might be looking at millions of gallons." "How long until this level floods completely?" Robert asked. 6 hours, David said after a moment's calculation. "Maybe 8 if we're lucky. But that ventilation shaft leads to Tunnel 12, which sits at a higher elevation. Once we get there, we'll have more time to work on the next climb." The drilling continued through the afternoon. The sound echoed through the flooded tunnels, a rhythmic percussion that was both reassuring and eerie. Every completed anchor point brought them closer to survival, but also drained their limited power supply. David monitored everything: battery levels, water rise rate, the men's physical and mental states. He was the captain of this unlikely vessel, responsible for keeping hope alive in the darkness. At 4:30 p.m., after 6 exhausting hours, Jack and Luis had created a climbing route of 15 anchor points leading up to a narrow ledge. From there, they could see the dark opening of the ventilation shaft, maybe 5 feet beyond their reach. Close, but not close enough. "We need to extend the raft," David said, surveying the situation. "If we can tilt it and create a ramp using the remaining plywood, someone light enough might be able to reach that ledge." Robert volunteered immediately. At 140 pounds, he was the lightest of the group. They spent the next hour reconfiguring the platform, using the metal drums as counterweights to create a stable incline. It was risky. One wrong move, and the entire structure could capsize, dumping all their supplies into the water. But David's engineering calculations held. The platform tilted at a 20-degree angle, just enough to give Robert the extra reach he needed. With a rope tied around his waist for safety, Robert climbed the anchor points they'd drilled into the wall. His movements were careful, deliberate. At the top, he stretched toward the ledge, his fingers just brushing the cold stone. He adjusted his footing, reached again, and this time caught hold. With a grunt of effort, he pulled himself up and onto the ledge, then disappeared into the ventilation shaft. 15 minutes of anxious silence followed. Then they heard Robert's voice echoing down from above. "It's clear. The shaft goes up about 30 feet, then opens into Tunnel 12. But you're not going to believe this. There's an old maintenance station up here. It's dry." Relief flooded through the crew. A dry space meant safety, at least temporarily. It meant they could rest, conserve their batteries, and plan their next move without the immediate threat of drowning. One by one, they climbed up to join Robert, carefully hauling their supplies in makeshift packs. The platform, their improvised lifeboat that had kept them alive through the first critical hours, was left behind to float in the darkness below. Tunnel 12 was a revelation. The maintenance station Robert had found was a small chamber carved into the rock, about 12 feet square. It contained old equipment, some rusted tools, and most importantly, it was elevated enough that the floodwater hadn't reached it yet. The men collapsed against the walls, exhausted from the climb and the constant adrenaline of the past 10 hours. David used his headlamp to explore the chamber more thoroughly. In one corner, he found an old storage locker. Inside were water-stained maps of the mine system, some emergency flares that might still work, and a manual hand-crank drill from the 1970s. It was heavy, slow, and would require immense physical effort to use, but it didn't need batteries. "Gentlemen," David said, holding up the hand drill, "this just bought us more time." They rested for 4 hours, taking turns keeping watch and sleeping. David used the time to study the old maps, comparing them to his mental knowledge of the current mine layout. Tunnel 12 connected to several other passages, most of which led toward the main shaft, now collapsed and flooded. But there was one route, marked on the 1970s map, but not included in the current blueprints, that showed an old emergency escape tunnel cutting diagonally upward through the rock. It would have been part of the original mine construction before modern safety systems were installed. "It might not even exist anymore," David admitted when he showed the others. "It could have been filled in or collapsed decades ago. But if it's still there, it could take us up 3 levels without having to navigate the flooded tunnels." "And if it's not there," Jack asked, "then we keep climbing, tunnel by tunnel, staying ahead of the water." David looked at each man in turn. "I won't lie to you. This is going to take days, maybe weeks. We're going to get hungry, tired, and scared. But we have skills, we have tools, and we have each other. As long as we keep moving up, we stay alive." Luis spoke up, his voice steady despite their circumstances. "My daughter's 9th birthday is in 2 weeks. I made her a promise I'd be there to teach her how to ride her new bike. I'm keeping that promise, which means I'm getting out of this mountain. So what's our next move?" David smiled in the darkness. That was exactly the attitude they needed. "We rest until the water forces us to move again. Then we search for that old escape tunnel. And if we can't find it, we engineer our way up, 1 level at a time, until we reach daylight." Through the ventilation shaft behind them, they could hear the steady sound of rising water, an ominous reminder that the mountain was slowly filling from below, like a massive underground reservoir. But in that small maintenance chamber on Tunnel 12, 5 men who should have died in the first 10 minutes of the collapse were instead planning, surviving, and refusing to give up. David checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. They had been trapped underground for 17 hours, only 26 days and 7 hours to go, though none of them knew it yet. For now, they had made it through the first critical phase. They had survived the initial flood, built a floating platform from scraps and climbed to safety. David Brennan's improvised engineering had worked, but the real test was just beginning. The water reached Tunnel 12 at 3:22 a.m. on the second day. They heard it coming, a distant rumbling that grew steadily louder until water began trickling through the ventilation shaft they'd used to escape the equipment bay. David had expected this. The flooded lower levels were now acting as a massive reservoir, and the pressure was pushing water up through every available passage. "Time to move," he said quietly, rousing the others from their fitful sleep. They'd rested for only a few hours, but it would have to be enough. They gathered their supplies, now considerably lighter after redistributing the weight and abandoning anything non-essential on the platform below. Using the old mine maps as a guide, they moved through Tunnel 12 toward the location where the emergency escape tunnel should be. The going was slow and treacherous. These upper tunnels hadn't been used in years, and the ceiling supports showed signs of age and neglect. Twice they had to clear debris from old cave-ins, carefully removing rocks while David assessed the stability overhead. After 2 hours of searching, they found it. Hidden behind a false wall of stacked limestone blocks, clearly placed there intentionally during some long-ago renovation, was a narrow opening barely 3 feet wide. David directed his headlamp into the darkness beyond and saw rough-hewn stairs carved into the rock, leading upward at a steep angle. "This is it," he said, unable to keep the relief from his voice. "This is the old emergency tunnel." They began the climb immediately, knowing the water would soon reach their current level. The stairs were uneven and crumbling in places, requiring careful footing. The tunnel was claustrophobically narrow, forcing them to move in single file with their packs scraping against the walls. But it was leading them upward, away from the flood, and that was all that mattered. The climb took 6 hours and brought them up through solid rock, bypassing tunnels 11, 10, and 9 entirely. David's legs burned with the effort, and he could hear the labored breathing of the men behind him. They were all feeling the effects of minimal food and water, combined with the physical and emotional stress of their ordeal. But they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant dying. The escape tunnel finally opened into Tunnel 8, one of the oldest sections of the mine. Here the ceiling was reinforced with massive timber beams that had been installed in the 1950s when the mine first expanded into these depths. The air smelled different here, less damp, with a hint of something else. David took a deep breath and realized what it was: a faint current of fresh air moving through the tunnel. "There's ventilation," he said, pointing to a series of small holes drilled through the ceiling. "We're getting closer to the surface." Timothy, who had been keeping track in his notebook, did some calculations. "If we started on level 8 and we've climbed through 3 levels, that puts us on level 5. That's still 1,500 feet of rock above us." It was a sobering thought, but also encouraging. They had climbed nearly half the distance from their original position to freedom. David established a new rest stop in a side chamber off Tunnel 8. They rationed their water carefully. Each man got 2 small sips every 4 hours. The energy bars were divided into portions so small they barely qualified as snacks. Hunger was becoming a constant companion, gnawing at their stomachs and draining their energy. On the 3rd day underground, they faced a new challenge. The route upward from Tunnel 8 required them to navigate through a section known as the Maze, a complex network of interconnecting passages that had been dug during exploratory drilling in the 1960s. Many of these passages led nowhere, ending in solid rock faces or old cave-ins. Without the current mine maps, and with only David's memory of the overall structure to guide them, getting lost was a real danger. "We mark our path," David instructed, using chalk from the equipment supplies to draw arrows on the walls. "And we stay together, no exceptions. If we get separated in here, we might never find each other again." They entered the maze at midday, though time had become increasingly abstract in the perpetual darkness. Their headlamps revealed a confusing warren of tunnels, branching in all directions. David tried to navigate using logic and his engineering knowledge, choosing passages that angled upward and showed signs of more recent use. But after 4 hours of wandering, he had to admit they were lost. Robert's water ran out first. He didn't mention it until Jack noticed him staring longingly at someone else's bottle. They shared what little remained, but it was clear they couldn't survive much longer without finding a new water source. Dehydration was becoming a critical threat, possibly more immediate than the rising water far below. It was Luis who spotted it, a damp patch on the tunnel ceiling where water was seeping through a crack in the rock. It wasn't much, barely a few drops per minute, but David recognized it as condensation from the surface. This was rainwater or snowmelt percolating down through the mountain, which meant they were relatively close to the surface compared to where they'd started. Using a small container, they collected the water drop by drop. It took 2 hours to fill a single bottle, but that bottle represented life itself. They took turns holding the container beneath the drip, a meditation in patience and gratitude. While they waited, David used the time to rest and think. They had been underground for 3 days. By now, massive rescue operations would be underway on the surface. News crews would have descended on the mine site. Their families would be holding vigils, praying for miracles. "What do you think they're saying about us up there?" Robert asked into the darkness. Jack answered first. They're saying we're dead. Nobody survives 3 days trapped underground like this. They're probably already planning the memorial service. And we'll have to prove them wrong, Timothy said firmly. My wife is up there. She's not burying an empty casket if I have anything to say about it. David listened to his crew talk about their families, their hopes, their fears. It was important to keep talking, to maintain their humanity in this inhuman situation. Silence led to despair, and despair led to giving up. As long as they kept talking, planning, and moving forward, they remained survivors rather than victims. On the 4th day, they finally escaped the maze. A passage marked with old safety symbols led them to Tunnel 6, a major artery that connected to multiple upper levels. Here, they found something unexpected, evidence of the rescue operation. Fresh drill marks on the ceiling, recent enough that rock dust still covered the floor. Someone was drilling exploratory shafts from above, trying to locate survivors or at least map the extent of the flooding. David's heart leaped. This meant rescue teams were closer than he'd dared hope, but it also presented a problem. The drilling might have weakened the structural integrity of surrounding tunnels. They would need to be extremely careful about which passages they chose to navigate. They followed the sound of drilling, which seemed to come from somewhere above and to the north. The effort required every ounce of remaining strength. They were running on fumes now. 4 days with minimal food and water, combined with constant physical exertion, had left them gaunt and weak. Jack had developed a concerning cough from breathing the dusty air. Luis's knee, injured during the initial climb, was swelling and causing him to limp badly. Timothy was fighting off bouts of dizziness that David recognized as early signs of severe dehydration, but they kept moving because the alternative was unthinkable. On the morning of the 5th day, or what David's watch told him was morning, though such concepts had lost meaning in the eternal darkness, they reached Tunnel 4. This was one of the highest operational levels of the mine, used primarily for administrative purposes and equipment storage. It was also, crucially, only about 600 feet below the surface. In a storage room off the main tunnel, they made a discovery that quite literally saved their lives. Cases of bottled water, intended for the surface office staff, but stored here for convenience. The bottles had been sitting in the cool, dry environment for who knows how long, but the seals were intact. They drank carefully at first, knowing that consuming too much too quickly after severe dehydration could be dangerous. But the water was the most delicious thing any of them had ever tasted. They found food too. Stale crackers, protein bars with expired dates, and canned goods left behind by workers. It wasn't gourmet, but it was calories and nutrients their bodies desperately needed. For the first time since the collapse, they ate real portions and drank without rationing. The effect on morale was immediate and dramatic. "We're going to make it," Robert said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "We're really going to make it out of here." David allowed himself to hope. They had climbed from level 8 to level 4, through flooding, collapsing tunnels, and the maze-like older sections. They had built a raft, found hidden water sources, and survived against impossible odds. 600 feet was still a formidable barrier, but it was achievable. "We rest here for a full day," David decided. "We eat, drink, and let our bodies recover some strength. Then we make the final push." They set up camp in the storage room, taking turns sleeping while others kept watch. The drilling sounds continued above them, sometimes close, sometimes distant. David tried tapping on the pipes and metal surfaces, attempting to send signals, but he couldn't tell if anyone heard them. The mountain was too massive, the sounds too easily lost in the labyrinth of stone. During his watch shift, David reflected on everything that had brought them to this point. His engineering degree, earned at great personal sacrifice while working night shifts to pay tuition. His 18 years in these mines, learning every tunnel, every geological quirk, every safety protocol. the countless decisions he'd made since the collapse, some intuitive, some calculated, all aimed at keeping 5 men alive. If even one decision had been wrong, they would all be dead by now. But they weren't dead. Against all probability, they were still fighting, still climbing, still believing in the possibility of seeing the sun again. David thought about his own family, his wife Janet, his 2 teenagers who thought their father's job was boring and unglamorous. What would they think now, knowing what he'd accomplished down here in the darkness? The rest period ended after 18 hours. The men rose, stretched, and prepared themselves for the final ascent. They loaded up with water bottles and food, taking everything portable from the storage room. Who knew what conditions they would face in the upper levels? The path from Tunnel 4 to the surface required navigating through the administrative section of the mine, which had its own challenges. These tunnels were smaller, designed for occasional foot traffic rather than mining equipment. Some passages were barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through, but they were also in better condition, with modern lighting systems installed, though currently non-functional due to the power outage from the collapse. They climbed air shafts using maintenance ladders, their headlamps revealing walls that became progressively less industrial and more finished as they ascended. They were entering spaces that surface workers visited daily, areas where the boundary between mine and surface world began to blur. On the 6th day underground, they reached level 2. They were now less than 300 feet from freedom. The drilling sounds were louder here, clearly audible through the ceiling in multiple locations. David could distinguish at least 3 separate drill operations, probably coordinated rescue attempts coming from different angles. In a conference room that seemed surreal in its normalcy, complete with a table, chairs and a whiteboard with old shift assignments still written on it, they found a working phone. David picked up the receiver with shaking hands and pressed it to his ear. Dead silence. The phone lines had been cut during the collapse, the same as everything else, but the discovery filled them with irrational hope anyway. They were in a place where phones existed, where people had meetings and worked normal hours. The surface was close. They spent that night, their 6th underground, in the conference room, resting on the carpeted floor. It was the most comfortable they'd been since the collapse, and the psychological impact of being in a human space rather than a mine tunnel was profound. They talked late into the night about what they would do when they got out, the meals they would eat, the people they would hug, the simple pleasures of sunshine and fresh air. Luis told them about his daughter's upcoming birthday. Jack talked about his plans to propose to his girlfriend. Timothy shared stories about his grandchildren. Robert admitted he'd been planning to quit the mine and go back to school. David spoke about his wife's garden and how he'd helped her plant roses last spring, never imagining that the memory of their fragrance would sustain him through weeks underground. The conversations were therapeutic, keeping their minds focused on life and future rather than the very real possibility that they might still not make it. They were close, so close, but 300 feet of rock still separated them from freedom. 300 feet where anything could go wrong. On the morning of the 7th day, they began the final push toward the surface. The route took them through a service tunnel that angled upward at nearly 45 degrees, a challenging climb even with the fixed ladders installed along its length. David went first, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. The metal was old but solid. They climbed slowly, methodically, conserving their energy for what might be a prolonged effort. They reached level 1 in the early afternoon. This was the uppermost level of the mine, the staging area where miners gathered before descending to the working levels. It consisted of large chambers used for equipment maintenance, supply storage, and the main shaft station where the elevator normally brought workers up and down. But the elevator shaft was destroyed. David could see where the entire structure had collapsed during the initial earthquake. The drilling sounds were extremely loud now, coming from directly above them. Dust and rock fragments fell from the ceiling with each impact of the drill bits. Rescue was happening on the other side of that rock, probably only 50 or 60 feet away. But they had no way to signal their presence, no way to tell the rescue teams that 5 men were alive and waiting just below their drill sites. "We need to make noise," David said. "A lot of noise, something that will register on their equipment." They gathered every metal object they could find, tools, pipes, empty gas cylinders, and began creating a rhythm. 5 men striking metal against rock, against pipes, against anything that would resonate. Bang, 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 pause. Bang, 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 pause. A deliberate pattern that couldn't be mistaken for random mine settling or equipment failure. They hammered for 2 hours straight, their arms aching with the effort. The drilling above continued, seemingly oblivious to their desperate signaling. Then suddenly it stopped. Complete silence filled the tunnel for what felt like an eternity. Then the drilling resumed, but now with a different rhythm. It was slower, more careful, and most importantly, it seemed to be responding to their signals. The rescue team had heard them. Hope surged through the crew like electricity. They continued their signaling, and the drilling continued in response. Over the next 6 hours, they established a crude form of communication. Sound patterns that indicated yes and no, allowing them to guide the rescue team toward their location. But then they hit a problem. The drill bit broke through into the chamber where they were waiting, creating a hole barely 6 inches in diameter, far too small for any of them to fit through. Through this tiny opening, they could see artificial light for the first time in 7 days, and they could hear voices shouting in excitement. The rescue team knew they were alive. A speaker was lowered through the hole, and for the first time since the collapse, David heard a voice from the surface. "This is Commander Ellen Roberts, Kentucky Mine Rescue. How many survivors?" "5!" David shouted back, his voice hoarse. "All alive. All mobile. We've been climbing for 7 days. The speaker crackled. "Your families are here. They're waiting for you. We're going to get you out, but we need to widen this hole safely. Can you move to a different chamber? We're worried about structural collapse if we drill too aggressively in your current location." David looked at his crew. They were so close, within sight of rescue, but they would have to move away from that tiny window of hope and wait longer. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, but also the determination that had kept them alive for 7 days. "We can move," David confirmed. "Tell us where." The voice guided them to a reinforced chamber about 200 feet away, a structural strongpoint that could withstand the vibrations from heavy drilling. They relocated and waited while the rescue team repositioned their equipment. Through the walls, they could hear the massive drill starting up again, this time with the power of surface-based machinery behind it. The drilling continued through the night and into the 8th day of their ordeal. David and his crew tried to rest, but excitement and anticipation made sleep nearly impossible. They were so close to freedom, they could taste it, could imagine the moment they would step into sunlight and breathe unfiltered air. But they also knew that rescue operations were dangerous, that the structural instability that had trapped them could also kill them in these final hours if anything went wrong. At 2:47 p.m. on the 8th day, the drill bit broke through into their chamber. This time the hole was 3 feet in diameter, large enough for a rescue worker to descend. Within minutes, a figure in rescue gear was rappelling down into the darkness where they waited. The rescue worker, a woman named Lieutenant Amy Foster, looked at the 5 miners and shook her head in amazement. "You boys are a miracle," she said simply. "We were drilling for bodies, not survivors. The general consensus was that anyone in the lower levels died in the first 12 hours. "We had a good engineer," Jack said, gesturing to David. "He kept us alive." More rescue workers descended, bringing medical supplies, food, and harnesses for the ascent. They checked each miner's vital signs, administered IVs to combat dehydration, and wrapped them in thermal blankets. The rescue team leader explained that they would be extracted one at a time through the drill hole, each man secured in a rescue harness and pulled up to the surface by a winch system. Robert went first, his small frame making him the easiest to extract. They watched as he was secured in the harness and lifted up through the hole, disappearing into the light above. Then Timothy, then Luis, each extraction taking about 20 minutes to complete safely. Jack insisted David go next. "You kept us alive, you should see the sun first." But David shook his head. "A captain is the last to leave his ship. You go." Jack was extracted, and finally, 9 hours after that first drill bit had broken through, David Brennan was secured in the rescue harness. As he was lifted up through the narrow passage, he saw the layers of rock sliding past, each one representing the geological history of these mountains. And then, suddenly, he was emerging into light so bright it hurt his eyes even through closed eyelids. The roar of the crowd hit him next, hundreds of voices cheering, crying, shouting in celebration. He felt hands reaching for him, pulling him clear of the drill hole, lowering him onto solid ground that wasn't 3,000 feet underground. Someone wrapped him in an American flag. Cameras flashed from every direction, but all David could focus on was the woman pushing through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Janet reached him and threw her arms around him, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "You came back," she kept repeating. "You came back to me." David held his wife and looked around at the scene surrounding them. His 4 crew members were there, reunited with their own families in emotional embraces. Beyond them were the news crews, the mine officials, the rescue workers who had drilled around the clock to reach them. And beyond all of that, the mountains that had tried to claim their lives, but had ultimately failed. They had been trapped for 8 days in total, 7 days of climbing and surviving before they made contact with rescue, then 1 more day waiting for extraction. But it had felt like 27 days of harrowing survival, each hour stretching into eternity in the darkness below. David had turned a flooded mine into a raft-bound lifeboat, had engineered solutions from scraps and desperation, and had led 4 men through what should have been an impossible climb. In the weeks that followed, investigations would reveal the full extent of what they had accomplished. They had climbed nearly 3,000 vertical feet through flooded and unstable tunnels. They had navigated through sections of the mine that hadn't been used in decades, using outdated maps and David's engineering knowledge. They had improvised solutions to problems that mine safety experts claimed were unsolvable under those conditions. Their survival was hailed as a miracle, but David knew better. It wasn't a miracle, it was engineering, determination, and 5 men refusing to accept death as an option. The raft David had built from plastic barrels and plywood was later recovered from the flooded equipment bay. It was placed in the Kentucky Mining Museum as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. Visitors still stop to look at it, trying to imagine the desperation and brilliance required to build such a thing while drowning in darkness. Luis made it to his daughter's birthday. Not only did he teach her to ride her bike, he did it with news cameras recording the moment, a symbol of hope and survival that aired nationwide. Jack proposed to his girlfriend in the hospital, and she said yes. Timothy returned to work as a mine safety consultant, using his experience to improve emergency protocols across the industry. Robert did go back to school, eventually earning a degree in emergency management. As for David Brennan, he became a mine safety inspector, dedicating his career to ensuring that what happened to them would never happen to another crew. He gave talks at engineering schools, explaining how theoretical knowledge becomes practical survival in crisis situations. He never went back underground for work, but sometimes, on difficult days, he would close his eyes and remember the weight of the mountain above him, the sound of water rising in the darkness, and the moment when he realized that survival wasn't about hoping for rescue. It was about engineering your own salvation. The mine itself was permanently closed following the disaster, deemed too unstable for continued operation. But the story of 5 men who climbed from the depths of the earth, who built a floating platform in a flood, who navigated through decades-old tunnels using outdated maps and sheer determination, that story lived on. It became the standard against which all other mining rescues were measured, a reminder that even when circumstances seem impossibly dire, human beings are capable of extraordinary feats when survival demands it. For 27 harrowing days, or 8 days that felt like 27, David Brennan and his crew proved that engineering expertise, cool-headed leadership, and absolute refusal to surrender can overcome even the mountain's attempt to claim what it considers its own. They emerged from darkness into light, from despair into hope, and from certain death into miraculous life. And in doing so, they gave every trapped miner who would come after them a gift more precious than gold. Proof that survival is possible, that innovation can defeat impossible odds, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the human spirit is stronger than the weight of an entire mountain.